Hello, everyone. This is Mr. U.S. History, and Abraham Lincoln is without a doubt one of our greatest presidents in the history of this country, and for numerous reasons, because he fought to preserve the Union and kept our country together in one of our darkest times. Not to mention the fact that it was under him that we got slavery completely abolished, as it should have been long ago. But and Abraham Lincoln's election also is what sparked the Civil War. Lincoln was elected in 1860 in a map that looked a lot like this. As you can see, Lincoln won nearly every single free state. New Jersey had been split between Lincoln and the Democratic candidate Stephen Douglas, while many of the slave states, the Deep South, had gone for John C. Breckinridge, while the Upper South had went to John Bell, and the state of Missouri, and as well as three electors from New Jersey, voted for Stephen Douglas. Now, Lincoln's election had caused the seven southern states of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida to all secede from the Union. Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia would later secede from the Union. And it's without if one of Lincoln's three opponents, whether it be Douglas, Breckinridge, or Bell, was elected to the presidency, the Civil War may not have even happened to begin with. So let's just say Lincoln was not elected president of the United States. Then how would the history of our country have changed? Well, for starters, for Lincoln to lose the election, just one thing needs to be changed, which is that the state of New York, he loses New York. This can be done if Lincoln is not able to, if he is unable to make peace with Thurlow Weed and William Seward, who he defeated in the convention. So, had Lincoln been unable to effectively communicate with Thurlow Weed, then it is and Thurlow Weed, by the way, controlled the entire Republican Party in New York, and Lincoln had already defeated their guy William Seward. So had there not been amends between the two, New York could have gone to Stephen Douglas. So what they did in this election was, while this may look like the vote was split in three ways, I actually made a video covering why why that is a misconception. Lincoln, in fact, would have still won the presidency if all the Democrats were unified, and the Democrats actually ran fusion tickets in New Jersey, New York, and in fact many of the northern states there were fusion tickets. And in New York, for example, Lincoln, let's just say the fusion ticket had won. So the plan was to divide up the electoral votes that had gone to the Democrats. 18 of those electoral votes would have gone to Stephen Douglas. 10 of those electoral votes would have gone to John Bell, and 7 would go to John Breckinridge. So in this final outcome, out of Lincoln's three opponents, Bell and Breckinridge would most likely advance to the House election, because in the House election, since there would be a deadlock in the Electoral College, yes, for Lincoln to lose, there had to have been a deadlock in the Electoral College. This would make the election go to the House of Representatives, and Stephen Douglas would most likely be eliminated because he did not have enough electoral votes to advance, and Bell and Breckinridge had surpassed him, mostly due to their support in the South. Now, in the event of a House contingent election, most of the Northern Democratic support would have gone to John Bell, who would have likely emerged as a compromise candidate, while many Southern Democrats would have voted for Breckinridge. Ultimately, I'm pretty sure that Breckinridge and Bell would come to an agreement, and Breckinridge would ultimately just give up all of his support to Bell. And in addition, many conservative Republicans in states like Indiana and Ohio could even vote for Bell rather than Lincoln. So let's just say in this scenario, John Bell is elected president instead of Abraham Lincoln. John Bell was very old, so John Bell's running mate was Edward Everett, who had been a very influential figure in American politics during this time. So if Bell was elected, the Civil War would not have happened at this time, mostly because the southern states would probably accept Bell, and not to mention, so to look at what a Bell presidency would look like, you have to look at what the Constitutional Union Party wanted. The Union Party during the election of 1860 had basically called for it was basically a more moderate version of the Southern Democrats. They were against secession they were against leaving the Union, but at the same time they had supported um, they had supported uh, basically preserving slavery, and they were willing to compromise over the issue of slavery. Basically, the Union Party was made up of guys like who were supporters of Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and Millard Fillmore. Bell himself was a very strong supporter of Millard Fillmore, so his presidency would be somewhat similar to that. And John Bell, for this time, he was very old. Actually, if he was elected president, he would have been one of the oldest presidents. He was around like 64 at this time, and his vice president Edward Everett would mostly be the more influential person. So let's look at Bell's career for a moment. Bell first served in the House of Representatives as a Democrat, but then he switched parties and became a Whig and served in the Senate. And Bell had opposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act despite being a slave-owning Southerner from the state of Tennessee, and he was a strong supporter of the Compromise of 1850, and he basically wanted to kick the can down the road when it came to slavery. And Bell, he had supported internal improvements and a national bank throughout his career, and he had also most likely when it came to the issue of slavery, Bell he had the issue over slavery during this period of time would mostly be whether or not slavery would be allowed into the territories of Utah and New Mexico, not to mention some of these other territories around here. So the territories of Utah and New Mexico had allowed popular sovereignty during the Compromise of 1850, or the idea that the citizens there would choose whether or not they would be free or slave. And not to mention, once Franklin Pierce he had secured the Gadsden Purchase and basically bought this region from Mexico. Many Southerners during this time, let's just say around the 1860s, would have wanted to split this area into a completely new state so they could allow slavery in there. But the Congress, which would be controlled by Republicans, would not have allowed it. And Bell would most likely be a supporter of the Crittenden Compromise, which was by his own Vice President John J. Crittenden, which would basically allow slavery in every single territory that was south of the 3630 line. And this was the only thing that Southerners would accept before they left the Union in our actual timeline, by the way. And Bell would most likely be increasingly disenchanted by the new anti-slavery Republican Party. So he would most likely switch parties and join the Democrats from being a constitutional unionist. And yeah, speaking of which, I forgot to mention that Bell actually joined the Confederacy during the Civil War, despite being a unionist during the 1860 election cycle. So the issue of slavery would be over the territories of Nevada, Utah, and Colorado as well. So Colorado would be admitted as a free state, most likely, or a free territory, because it was already established as such by James Buchanan, not to mention Utah, which would so in Utah they had the popular sovereignty idea, but many people in Utah had supported the practice of slavery, so Utah would probably be admitted as a slave territory and later a slave state. Nevada, on the other hand, would probably be carved out of Utah. It already had been under Buchanan, and this one the territory of Nevada would probably want to be admitted in as a free state. So this would be the map over here. The really contentious area would be New Mexico, because New Mexico, many of the settlers there had opposed slavery, though there would not have been enough white settlers in the region to determine, which is what leads to the next problem, which is that the fact that New Mexico borders Southern California and Texas. And keep in mind that Southern California and Texas were both very pro-slavery and pro-secession during the Civil War. So it's very likely that they would come into the New Mexico territory in droves. Not to mention that New Mexico would probably end up like Kansas during this time period, which is when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was made. The tons of people moved into Kansas to make sure it would become a freer slave state. But many of these settlers who were moving into Kansas who were opposed to slavery were from places like New England or Iowa or very like abolitionist areas. Though New Mexico is pretty far away, and many of the Southern Californians and Texans would make sure it gets admitted as a slave territory. John Bell would have strongly supported admitting New Mexico as a slave state to the Union, and it is very likely that New Mexico, mostly because of Texas and California, becomes a slave territory, as well as the fact that the southern parts of New Mexico were very strongly in favor of slavery. And the Republican Party is so during this time period, the Republican Party would most likely nominate a candidate. I don't know who, but that candidate would most likely be John Bell's successor. I don't know if John Bell would run for a second term. He probably would not even win because he would be viewed by many in the North as an instrument of slave power. That idea again. And so basically, to give you a preview, slavery survives much longer than it actually did, and it even expands westward. Not to mention the fact that the gradual end of slavery takes a lot longer, as well as the fact that the official abolition of slavery in the United States does not happen until like at least 30 years from the 1860s. Mostly, and it would mostly happen because of the UK and France and the other European powers more than anything, because of the growing abolitionism growing in that territory. So I have to say, no matter what, slavery would most likely be abolished in the United States, and a civil war would be pretty much inevitable ever since the Dred Scott decision came. So pretty much not really much changes in the scenario, really. All that happens is the issue of slavery really just gets kicked down the road because of a John Bell presidency. So ultimately, John Bell, not much would change if he was president. He would be viewed today most likely as an instrument of the slave power that had controlled President Buchanan and Franklin Pierce, as well as basically another guy who just tried to kick the can down the road as much as possible. So ultimately nothing much changes. The Civil War just happens a lot later than it really did happen. So anyway, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure you like and subscribe. And yeah, I'll be making a lot more of these what if videos in the future, I think. I think these are very interesting videos. So anyway, bye.